All right, now picking up where we left off in the starter program, we had just managed to randomize the order of trials. So now our program is showing us a random sequence of red and green circles. And now it's time to actually be able to collect responses and record those responses to the stimuli that we're showing. Obviously, these stimuli are not interesting. We would never do an experiment this silly, not anymore. I mean, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, this might have been a very exciting experiment. Nowadays, it's not very exciting, but just to show you the foundation of how we show a stimulus and collect responses. Now we're going to collect the responses. I'm going to split this video up into two parts. So in the next part, I'll show you how to record those responses in a log file. So this video is going to be kind of unsatisfying at the end because we won't be able to know whether or not we're actually getting the responses until we get the log file and are able to see that yes, we have in fact collected the responses and they're collected properly. But anyway, so without further ado, let's get moving. All right, so in order to collect responses, this experiment is just going to be left and right button push. We'll use the simple mnemonic right for red. So a right button push if it's a red circle, left button push if it's a green circle. And so it would be handy throughout the rest of our code if we have defined values for that. So I'm going to pound define left, and I'm going to say that's 1, and pound define right and call that 2. And those numbers are completely arbitrary. You could use 13 and 17 if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter. Although the 1 and 2 does have kind of a nice mapping because that's actually the numbers for the corresponding mouse buttons. So mouse button 1 is the left mouse button and mouse button 2 is the right mouse button. So I guess it's kind of not arbitrary, but it absolutely wouldn't make a difference in how your code ran what numbers you use here. Okay, so the next thing we need in order to collect responses is an array to actually store those responses, what those responses are going to be. So I'm going to call this trial rep for trial report. You can call it anything you want, anything that makes sense to you. And of course this is an array and it needs to have as many elements as we have trials. And of course that's in square brackets. Okay, and because it's I'm using a slightly bigger font, so hopefully this is a little bit more visible to you guys. But because it's going off the edge of the screen, I'm just going to hit return here so that I put it down on the next line so that we can still see it all. All right, so now we have a new array, and that is the trial report or trial rep array. And in order to give that array values, we're going to set it equal to the trial call. All right, so here's our loop, our for loop, in which we are calling the trials. Remember we randomized this loop in the last video. So now what I'm going to do is set trial rep I as this loop runs. I starts at 0 and then it goes up by 1 every time we go through the loop, equal to that trial call. And so I do that for green, and of course I'm going to do the same thing for red trials. So our trial report is equal to now whatever is returned by trial. So remember, any function that's not a void has to return a value, and we made trial an int, an integer function. So it's returning an integer, and of course right now we are returning 0 because we didn't know what else to return at that time, but now we're going to see what to return. Okay, but before we get there, we need to do, I think, one more thing to the main function, because we're going to be using the mouse as input, and I talk about in the book why the mouse is preferable to the keyboard. Of course, a button box is the best thing, and we'll get to button boxes later in the course, but for now, just to get us up and running, we're going to use a mouse. But to do that, Allegro has mouse handling functions, but to use those functions, we need to initialize the mouse. And so we do that with, hang on, let me scroll my cheat sheet to make sure that I get this right. I don't want to make a mistake. Of course, I've made about 40 on this video already. All underscore install underscore mouse, open and close parens. And of course, this is one of those lines that needs a semicolon at the end. So all install mouse. And that function will now alert Allegro that we're going to be using the mouse. Okay, and now it's time to move on to the trial function itself. And we need to do a few things to trial in order to collect a response. One of the first things we need to do in trial is define an integer variable that is the response. And so we're just going to call it response. And right from the get-go, we're going to set it equal to 0. I'm not sure why we have to do that. But if we don't do it, we actually get an error saying that we're using a variable before it's initialized, even though we're using it when we're initializing it by giving it the value of the response. So I'm not sure why that happens. It actually does not happen in C. I don't have that problem in C, but here in C++ I do get that error. Sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't, when I don't initialize a variable right as I declare it. You can see here, like for example, we don't have to initialize target size right away. But we do have to initialize a response before we can use it. So we're going to set it equal to 0. Now remember, we defined left and right as 1 and 2 up here. So that means if I ever get a response 0, that tells me that on that trial, the participant did not respond. So I didn't get a response from the participant on that trial for whatever reason. Maybe the participant did respond, but it just didn't register. The mouse didn't register or something. I mean, those kind of things can sometimes happen. You can sometimes have hardware issues, but those are pretty rare. It's most likely that the subject just didn't respond if I get a 0 now. Okay, and the other thing, of course, in order to have trial return this value, instead of returning 0 here, we're going to return the response. And so now when main calls trial, trial runs, collects a response, and whatever that response is, that's what trial returns, and then main sets that response equal to the ith element of the trial rep array. All right, but in order to make that happen, we're going to start here in the while loop that times that blank space after the stimulus goes off, and here is where we're actually going to collect the response. Oh, and in order to do that, we need to declare one more thing here in the trial. An Allegro mouse state, and we'll just call it state, because why not? Okay, so an Allegro mouse state, it works kind of like a variable or kind of like an Allegro color. You have to declare it, and then you have to set it somewhere. Actually, no, you don't have to set it. What am I saying? Okay, so now we want to, down here, while we're timing that blank space after the stimulus, we want to get the mouse state. So all underscore get mouse underscore state and state. All right. And I wish I was coder enough to tell you why we have to put that ampersand there. I could probably look it up online on Stack Overflow or something and figure it out. But all I know is you have to do that. You have to refer to the state that way. Okay, so we're going to get the mouse state, and then what if it's a left button push? So if all mouse button down. This is another Allegro function that polls to see if the mouse button is down. And what are we polling? We're polling the mouse state, and left button is button 1. So if all mouse button down and state 1, that means the left mouse button is pushed. What are we going to do about it? We are going to set response equal to left. Now, what if it's the right button that's pushed? Else if all mouse button down and state 2, then make the response equal right. Okay, so now after the stimulus goes off, if there is a left button push, that will set the response value equal to left. If there's a right button push, that will set it equal to right. If there's no button push, response will be left like it is, 0. And then trial will return the response at the end of that period. Now, our stimulus duration is half a second. For most of us, that's probably plenty of time to decide whether we're seeing red or green and even get a button push executed. So it's possible that somebody will push the button during the stimulus duration while the stimulus is still going on. So we're just going to take all this that we just did during that blank interval, and we are going to copy it. Again, I'm using right click so you can see what I'm doing. Normally I would use Control C and Control V, and then paste right in here in the while loop. Remember, this is the while loop that times the stimulus right after we flip the display. Okay, so now if the participant responds during the stimulus or during the blank period after the stimulus, either way, it is going to set their response equal to whichever button they pushed and return that to the main function. Okay, that is actually it for this video. And so in the next video, I'll show you how to generate a log file that records these outputs, records these responses, and then we'll actually know whether we got this code right. Real quickly before we leave, I'm going to go ahead and run it just to make sure I haven't introduced any bugs. Let's just make sure that we still get our random sequence of, yep, there it goes. All right, cool. So no bugs. It's running as of right now, and I assume it's recording, well, not recording. I assume that it would be collecting those responses if I was pushing the mouse button right now, but I won't know that for sure until I get a log file that actually records them. All right, see you in the next one.